Talking about his Nobel Prize winning ceremony, well, in fact, it was 1926, and he was nominated for the Nobel Prize alongside Fibiger.
Oh, yeah.
And so both of them were to share the prize. And did he actually attend this ceremony? And he was hugely disappointed, perhaps even angered, to find out that he was left out. Only Fibiger won the prize and his name was not read.
Yeah, I mean, did he actually attend? I don't remember that detail, though. Maybe you're right. But what's certainly true is that it was believed that if you look at the records, it was a split decision. They decided that the award would be shared, and then without any explanation, Fibiger was announced and Warburg wasn't. I never got to the bottom of that mystery. I don't think anybody has. There must be some documents somewhere which explain how Warburg was left off of that, but I never got to the answer.
That must have hurt his ego.
Oh, yeah.
And he was very resentful, and he was openly resentful in his letters to his sister, letters to other scientists. He was very resentful about that fact.
Yeah, which led to another classic Warburg line. When he finally did get it, his first response was, "It's about time."
It's about time is what he said. Yes, that was interesting too.
Yeah,
so, and that was in 1931, I think he won the...
Right.
We did talk about the Nazi project and Hitler's or the Nazi sort of obsession of purifying Germany, not only on a societal level, but also purifying, I think, the environment, German environment. Hitler himself was obsessed. He had his own farm. He grew his food in his own farm. He didn't want, pesticides or fertilizers to be used in his farm. So, so would you say that also is part of the same ideology of purification, purifying not only this German society, but also purifying the soil, purifying the food. And he, I think, purified his diet, or in his mind he did, by becoming a vegetarian or a raw vegan.
Yeah. I mean, first I should say, which, is self-evident, that just because Hitler or the Nazis did something doesn't mean, it's wrong. I mean, even evil people sometimes do the correct thing or have the correct belief on one particular area. But, it is true that in some cases they took reasonable ideas, like, being concerned about, the wrong kind of chemicals, and then took it to an extreme that, was awful and a reflection of their ideology. So even, they even had, Nazi gardeners and only wanted to grow, certain types of plants that reflected, the superior Aryan, agricultural tradition, and on and on. I mean, it's all absurd, but that, at the core of some of these ideas, there were reasonable things. Being concerned about carcinogens and environmental chemicals is reasonable. They just took it to, a real extreme. But what is really uncomfortable in a lot of ways is that in the post-war period, a lot of these ideas continued to flourish and they became more mainstream and in many ways positive. The whole idea of whole foods started, but when you look back, you see that, unfortunately, some of the influential people had been Nazis. And then, after the war, these ideas took on different form, and it became sort of uncomfortable for everyone to see, the Nazi roots of some of these ideas, which again, doesn't mean that they're wrong. Many of the environmentalists in the post-war period, or of course, were the opposite end of the spectrum. They hated the Nazis more than anything, but some of them did have Nazi backgrounds.
For me, one of the saddest endeavors, I think, that led by the Nazis was the plantations. I think it all started with the Dachau plantation, where they used the wars of prisoners of war, the Roma, Jews, homosexuals, anyone who was obviously imprisoned, to grow plantation.
Yeah.
And also they did some medical experiments on these people. That was
Yeah.
quite sad. But
Yeah, no, it's really an extraordinary thing that, at these death camps, side by side, they have, you know, organic farms, some of the first organic farms, and they're taking prisoners and forcing them to run these farms. So it's just a incredibly revealing portrait of the Nazi mind, I think, to see these two things side by side. And, and that's why Robert Proctor talks about that, to us, it looks like the most incredible contradiction, but in the Nazi mind, it's all connected, I think. And it was really shocking to me to see that all these ideas about nutrition, agriculture, and then seeing them use the prisoners and the camps to test these ideas. And the first experiments that they did on prisoners were actually cancer experiments.
Yeah, it's interesting because it did. It was successful project in a sinister way, because it started off with the cow plantation, and then 14 other farms were added.
Yeah, yeah.
List.
Yeah. And they were supplying the SS in particular with a lot of this organic food. Himmler was particularly obsessed with a lot of these issues, had an agricultural background.
Right. Okay, so Warburg did leave Germany, and I think it was after the end of the Second World War. He had a post at the University of Illinois in America, where he played a particularly difficult character.
Yeah.
And of course, it didn't. The post of his visa wasn't renewed, either that or his post wasn't extended. But tell us more about that. He always used to leave Germany, but he did end up leaving Germany. He didn't like it there. He refused to speak English, even though he was fluent in English. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, that's one of my own personal favorite parts of the book, because so much of the book, when you're writing about cancer and Nazis, is obviously not very fun, but there are some comic episodes, I think, and this is certainly a more comic episode that Warburg, who thinks of himself as a king but has nowhere to go after the war. The Americans have actually taken over his institute as part of their government in West Germany. And Warburg finally gets an invitation to come to the University of Illinois. And the idea is that they're going to settle a longstanding debate about photosynthesis. And it just goes disastrously wrong from the moment he arrives. There's so many examples, but he insisted that the heat not be turned on, even though, it was winter. So everybody was walking around freezing. He refused to speak English, even though he could speak English. They put his partner Heiss up in a fraternity house, and you have to understand, like, Warburg is the most aristocratic human who's ever lived. The thought of him even stepping foot into a fraternity house just cracks me up. He literally drove his host crazy, to the point where these wonderful, generous people one of them was just riding in a bus around and around, like trying to deal with Warburg, and it went wrong in every way. But he was very lucky that, the Americans allowed him to come back and get his institute back. And he sort of went back to his old way of life in 1950. And, one of the chilling things about it is that, he didn't really look back. It was 5 years after the Holocaust, after World War II, and he just kind of proceeded ahead without, with rarely mentioning what had happened in Germany.
Had a sense of entitlement. Didn't he? He thought they had to do that for him. They had to provide him with this, and he loved the good life. He loved the luxury, the aristocratic kind of environment. His furniture. He insisted on moving his furniture with him, for example, from one place to another.
Antique furniture. But I actually think that explains a lot about his theories about cancer too. Is he saw the cancer cell or any cell in sort of an aristocratic light, that respiration with oxygen is the higher level and fermentation is the lower level. And fermentation, he also argued, arose earlier in the evolution of a cell. So it was like a lower form of life. And I think that's played into how he thought about cancer as well.
Well, there is a beautiful quote in the book. I'll read it, and it says, Warburg didn't yet have answers, but his path to greatness, he knew, was hidden inside the cancer cell. I thought I'd read that quote, and I think it was one of the most beautiful quotes in the book. Let's talk about his partner, because his partner was more than just his homosexual partner. His partner actually assisted him in his scientific research throughout his life. What do we know about him?
We don't know as much as I would like, and I found it hard. I really searched hard for more information about his partner's background, his family background. It's hard to find, but Jakob Heiss, or Jacob Heiss, was his partner. He also was in World War I, and after the war, somebody sort of recommended to Warburg that they take on Heiss as like a, what they used to call like a houseboy, like a servant. And I think that, the person who recommended this probably knew that they were both likely gay and was making an arrangement. It's hard to know for sure, but, from the moment he arrived, they were virtually inseparable. And, it's very clear that it was a loving relationship. And, after the war, Heiss also became the secretary of the institute, and they were literally, together all day, all night. And Heiss, baked for him and cleaned for him, and really acted like a bodyguard. He would chase the media away when they bothered Warburg. So it was, he was kind of a tough guy. I talked to some of the people who worked in the institute, and they remembered Heiss yelling at them. I think the most admirable thing about Warburg is that he didn't hide that relationship more. In fact, he would be invited to speak in another country, and he would say, well, I'll only do it if you also allow Heiss to come along. He was so arrogant that he also didn't worry about being persecuted as a gay man in the way that other people might have. I think it's a very nice story. And one thing that makes me happy is when I went to Germany to do research, and I went to Warburg's grave, I saw that Heiss was buried, right next to him, which, wouldn't have been an obvious thing to do in 1984 when Heiss died. So I was very happy to see that.
And in fact, Heiss carried on his legacy after Warburg died at the age of 85, because Heiss was probably over 10 years younger than him. So he stayed looking after the institute until an appropriate candidate came along to take over.
Yeah, no, it's kind of incredible that Heiss was in that position. He had no scientific training, but I saw from his letters that he actually, by living with Warburg his whole life, he had actually learned a lot of chemistry himself and could talk about the supplies in a fairly sophisticated way. And so they actually put Heiss in charge of finding Warburg's replacement, but it didn't go very well. And they eventually, sort of gave up on the idea. And now Warburg's Institute is actually the archives of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which I like, because I think I say this in the book, that, now researchers can go there and find, information about Warburg's enemies and their Nazi past, which he would have liked.
Heiss was loyal, unbelievably loyal to, and defended him throughout his life. But they also had a dog.
Yeah, they love dogs.
Warburg himself insisted that they, whenever they moved to I think it was Illinois, the first move, that they also moved the dog.
Yeah, they eventually gave up on that, but they were trying to bring the dogs, and they were, worried about how, the people in Illinois were worried about how they were going to feed the dogs and care for them, and it was a whole disaster. They finally gave up on that, but they absolutely love dogs. And my favorite picture of Warburg, it appears early in the book, is Warburg posing with one of his poodles. I don't know if you remember that photo. I actually wanted to put that in the cover. That's another thing that they didn't listen to me about. It was a huge part of their lives, the dogs. And in fact, at the end of Warburg's life, his dog would be driven around in, like a Mercedes limousine with Warburg. And sometimes, even just the driver and the dog.
He was extremely loving towards his own sister as well. But the relationship that he had with his own father didn't seem to be that loving, or was it? Yeah. He always wanted to outdo his father, I think. He wanted to be a better scientist than his father. What else was going on there?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, he clearly revered his father. He revered Einstein and his father and saw them as brilliant scientists. His father did some of the experimental work that showed Einstein was right about light and photochemical reactions. But at the same time, as you mentioned, he wanted to outdo his father. His father played classical music together with Einstein and others, and Warburg gave up music because he saw that he wasn't going to be able to be as good as his father, and he couldn't stand that. And you look at their letters, you see tension. Warburg, describing his accomplishments, the father criticizing his handwriting. So it's a lot of classic father-son stuff. But what's interesting to me is that I think Warburg went into the realm of biology because he saw that he wouldn't be able to outdo his father in the world of physics, and he thought he could take all the ideas of physics and bring them into the world of biology, and that is indeed what he did. He studied cancer through the lens of energy, of course, but also some of his key discoveries were in the realm of photosynthesis, which is really the perfect bridge between the physics of his father and in the biological world. His big question was, how many quanta are necessary to run photosynthesis, and that became a huge debate. But he also made really important discoveries with that involved the tools of a physicist in terms of measuring respiration and measuring enzymatic reactions. So his father's influence, I think, can be seen in everything he did.
So let's talk about, and this is science talk, so let's talk about the question of photons and how they interact with atoms. And I think this whole sort of debate went on for decades, and Warburg insisted he was right. So let's talk more about that.
Yeah, to me, I mean, I should clarify that this area, is outside of my expertise. I mean, I don't know if I have any expertise, but certainly this area is outside of my expertise. But, it was one part of Warburg's life, so I did want to include it in the book. But, the central question, is really how many photons are required to power a photosynthesis, a photosynthetic reaction. And Warburg thought it was one, and others were saying that it required 4. And, Warburg, was convinced it was a smaller number because he was also convinced that nature was extremely efficient. And, he looked at it like a physicist. And at one point, he even went back to Einstein and says, how can you be so sure it only takes 1 photon? And Einstein's response was, well, that's a lot. But the problem was that, when other people measured it, they saw that indeed it seemed to be that more photons were required, and that there were actually multiple steps in photosynthesis that Warburg hadn't really understood when he first made this hypothesis. But Warburg, rather than seeing that, people were building on his idea and clarifying it, just could not accept any correction whatsoever. So he lashed out and got into this, massive scientific feud, which he was ultimately wrong about. But that was his greatest flaw, which was, more pronounced in the post-war period, is that he could not admit he was wrong about anything. And it became, particularly in the realm of photosynthesis, became an embarrassment for him. And in the cancer realm, he sort of, I think he was ultimately right on the big questions, but he fought so hard on the smaller questions that he ended up undermining his reputation in a way that I think set cancer science back.
He was obnoxious, wasn't he? Because he applied for a grant, and his grant application letter just was basically two lines. I need this much money, and that's it.
Yeah, that's another classic Warburg. You a 2-sentence grant proposal, like as you said, and but he got it. He got the money.
He got the money.
Yeah, no, that's exactly his personality.
And also, I thought he was obnoxious when he engaged in an open debate with two other scientists, American scientists, who had opposing views. And it looked like the American scientists had actually won the debate, but he came out of it and he published it everywhere and he told everyone he'd defeated them.
Yeah, yeah. I think, in his last years, he was really, making some extreme claims. And I think, he was getting older. I think that was part of it. But part of it, as I've said before, it's just he could not admit he was wrong. But what's interesting is, when he wasn't talking about himself, he could make all the right kind of statements. He would say that, theories don't really matter. What matters is what you can demonstrate with evidence, and that you shouldn't be attached to your theories because, ultimately, they just follow what your findings. But in reality, when it came to his own work, he became, obsessed with the theories and wouldn't give up on them. So it's a shame because I think he had a lot of perspective and insight, with respect to other scientists, but could not, when it came to his own science, he just didn't have that perspective. And that's, of course, to some extent true of everybody. But in his case, the distinction was all the more pronounced.
It's you describe how he attended that symposium where he was going to face or debate, I think it was photosynthesis in Strasbourg, where he was going to debate photosynthesis with his American counterparts. And he was 81 at the time. And he came all posh, and that's a British expression. So he was very well dressed, and he had a
big
beautiful
too.
Yeah, big cowboy hat and a nice suit, cream-colored suit. So I love your description of him when he attended that symposium.
Yeah, I think that's when I said in the book that he had gone full diva. Like, he was wearing a cowboy hat. He was showing up in a chauffeur. Like, you just couldn't mess with him at that point. He would get on stage. Like, he went to one symposium of Nobel Prize winners. He got up on stage with a few charts and said, "This is all you need to know about cancer. Everything else is garbage." And then he, just sort of walks off the stage, what we'd call a mic drop now. So, it's kind of funny, but it's also a shame because, his ideas were so important and people stopped taking him seriously, when he started doing these things.
I think there was an offer or a proposal, this is post-war, to him to set up another brand new institute when his institute was taken over. I can't recall now who made the proposal, but his response was, "I've solved the mystery of cancer, so there's no need for an institute."
Yeah, that was another incredible line. And in the 50s, they talked about, or somebody else within the Max Planck Society, had looked into this idea of starting a new cancer institute, and Warburg's response was, "I've done it already. What are we going to study? I've already figured it all out." But I think he was too old at that point. I think maybe some part of him recognized that he was not going to be able to make the type of discoveries he had made earlier in life.
But towards, I think, in the last decade or two of his life, he did make significant contributions to science, especially when he wrote about the enzymes. I've got all of that in my notes. The aldolase was one. He discovered an important enzyme, the aldolase. He talked about coenzymes, and his work about coenzymes nearly brought him close to second Nobel Prize, which never received it.
I think he deserved 3 Nobel Prizes. The first one for cancer, the second one for respiration, and the third one for his work on coenzyme. I think he truly deserved 3, and I'm sure he would agree with me on that. And it was all within a relatively short period. This period from the early 1920s into the mid to late 30s is when he did his greatest work, and he was really just revolutionizing biochemistry. And many people actually think his work on coenzymes was his most valuable contribution or his most remarkable research. And again, to this day, the type of reactions that he focused on and how coenzymes and NAD function in a cell is a very hot area of interest. So he deserves a lot of credit for that as well. And, one irony that I pointed out in the book is that Warburg, wanted to make a great discovery that would save lives. And in fact, his work actually led to new discoveries with vitamins that, cured pellagra and other diseases. So he really did do what he set out to do, but I don't think he ever really realized it.
I think he was the first to discover the molecule nicotinamide niacin with vitamin B3. So he has some significant work in that field. He never got awarded the second Nobel Prize.
Yeah, I mean, he claimed that he didn't get it only because Hitler had said no Germans would accept the Nobel Prize, but I didn't find evidence to really support that claim. It is certainly possible that they didn't bother to give it to him knowing that, but I didn't find evidence supporting Warburg's statement that they were about to give it to him and then had to take it back.